Thanks for listening to this special post-season interview episode of Melting into Air. Our second season will premiere in fall 2026. If you'd like to support the show, please rate and review us on Apple or wherever you get your podcasts. You can also subscribe to our Patreon for exclusive content, including an upcoming Q&A episode. For more information about today's material, please visit our website at meltingintoair.net. Thanks again for listening. I hope you enjoy the episode. Ira Aldridge was one of the most celebrated stage actors of the early Victorian period. Born into a black family in the United States, he rose to international superstardom after taking his career to London, where he played leading roles in everything from Shakespearean tragedies to lurid imperial melodramas. As a performer, Aldridge dramatized important topics like Atlantic slavery, and he crossed the color line by playing characters like Richard III and King Lear. Audiences simply couldn't get enough. So who was Ira Aldridge? How did he rise to stardom despite racial prejudice? And what does his extraordinary life reveal about race, politics, and popular culture in the 19th century? Today, I'm joined by a very special guest. Professor Greg Vargo teaches English at New York University. He has authored a book titled An Underground History of Early Victorian Literature and edited 2 collections of plays, Chartist Drama and Ira Aldridge on the Stage, an anthology. The latter appeared this year from Edinburgh University Press. It features plays starring the first black celebrity of the British stage, Ira Aldridge. Hi, Greg. Thanks for coming on the show.
Thank you so much for having me. Pleasure to be here.
Let's start by setting the scene for our listeners. Ira Aldridge was born into a free black family in New York City in 1807. What did the system of Atlantic slavery look like in that year, and how did it evolve as Aldridge grew up?
Aldridge's life coincided with monumental changes in the system of slavery and empire, and his career played out against the backdrop of these momentous changes and was kind of inevitably read against it because his status as the first black star of the stage in Britain and the corpus of his plays, which I hope we'll have a chance to talk about. There were also kind of many calendrical coincidences. The year of his birth, both Britain and the United States outlawed the international slave trade in 1807. Now, the international slave trade did not affect the internal domestic trade in the United States or the intra-colonial trade in Britain, but nevertheless, the transatlantic trade was outlawed. So there's a moment of kind of gaining momentum for the cause of abolition. A year before he journeyed to Britain, another kind of crucial point in his life in 1824 or 1825, but a year before that, there was a major slave uprising in Demerara, which was a British colony off the coast of South America and is present-day Guyana. Once again, his life kind of syncs up with the kind of huge canvas of history. There's been a recent trend in scholarship to emphasize the role that enslaved people played in winning their own freedom in things like the Demerara slave revolt or the Denmark Vesey rising in Charleston in 1822, 2 years before Aldridge left the United States. Aldridge's corpus takes up these questions of what Black agency and slavery looks like.
So the trade between Africa and America is gone, but in other words, the tensions maybe are even higher than they were before because now there's this contradiction. You're not allowed to bring enslaved people in, and yet slavery still thrives across North and South America.
Yeah. So the trade between Africa and the United States and the British Caribbean is gone, not the Spanish Caribbean. The tension certainly kind of rises. 1807 is very much in response to the wave of revolutions and insurrections in the Caribbean in the time of the French Revolution, preeminently in Haiti, the first really full free republic in the Western Hemisphere. There's a kind of an idea that people brought from Africa are more likely to revolt, where if slavery could become self-sustaining, people born into slavery will accept their condition. This, inevitably proves false, but that is the hope of the kind of architects of empire.
Tell us about Aldridge's early life in the United States. What do we know about his childhood and his career as a teenage actor?
So his family were members of a thriving free Black community in New York City. His father was a minister and a straw vendor. Not much is known about his mother other than that she was born free and moved to New York City a bit later in life. Aldridge, we know, attended one of the two Black schools in the city. And I should say that New York State doesn't outlaw slavery until after Aldridge departs. So they had passed gradual emancipation, but adults didn't win emancipation until the late 1820s. Now, a formative influence on Aldridge were the theaters of William Alexander Brown, who started the first Black company in the United States. There's a wonderful book about this company by Marvin McAllister. Its title is White People Do Not Know How to Behave at Entertainments Designed for Ladies and Gentlemen of Color. But at any rate, it's the first Black company in the United States. They perform Shakespeare, comedy, song and dance. They perform historical melodrama, including two plays about Caribbean slave revolts. One, King Shot Away, is the first play authored by an African American, and the other is Obie or Three Finger Jack. Interestingly, many of Aldridge's later plays were performed at William Alexander Brown's various theaters. The American Theater, the Minor Theater, and then the African Company are various names associated with it. Modern day, it's remembered most as the African Grove, which was his first enterprise, which was kind of a garden for tea and performance of song and maybe dramatic recitations. This theater was very controversial. It was trespassing on domains of white culture. A show was interrupted with the arrest of actors in the middle of a performance of Shakespeare. Brown agreed not to perform Shakespeare anymore. The plays about the Caribbean revolts were especially incendiary because they were staged right in the wake of the Charleston Revolt of 1822. It was, performing this amazing corpus in the face of sustained white harassment. What was Aldridge's relationship to the theater? And I had to say that is a bit unclear. There is a memoir published in 1848 called The Memoir of Ira Aldridge, though almost for sure not written by him. It includes much that's very positive and anti-racist, but it also sometimes traffics in kind of racist stereotypes. So this memoir says that he was an actor there, but there's very thin documentary evidence. There's many playbills from the theater and none list Aldridge. And there's also newspaper reports. So I think that we don't actually know if Aldridge performed at William Alexander Brown's theater. But we do know that he attended it and that he was inspired by it. That's something about Aldridge's New York life and this moment of efflorescence of Black theater.
That's fascinating. And I'm always impressed by the research that scholars are able to do into people before they became famous, because it really is extraordinarily hard to learn anything about 19th century people except for like the uppermost crust of the upper crust, right?
Yeah, it's really fascinating. And it's fascinating for Aldridge, the first 5 years of his career. He's just, one of thousands of actors in Britain. And you begin to leave a paper trail, but it's mostly a paper trail of playbills and potentially newspaper advertisements. Nobody was collecting his letters from that point in his life.
So why did Aldridge travel to England in 1824? And what kind of world did he enter there? How was it distinct from what he had experienced in New York City up until that time?
Yeah, so he travels in 1824, probably, or potentially 1825. And it seems that he travels there in order to become an actor. It's after the kind of final closing of the ventures of the African Company. Their leading star, James Hewlett, actually will travel to England a few years later. So it seems like denied opportunities for performance in the United States. He seeks it in Britain and ultimately succeeds at it. He has a several month stint in London in the spring and summer of 1825, but then he embarks upon a career as a traveling actor. And really the next 2 to 3 decades of his life, he tours cities and towns, large and small, around the whole of the United Kingdom. He was especially popular in Ireland, but also popular in Scotland. In those early years, he is in an economically precarious position. I mean, he's a teenager of 17 or 18. And like many actors, he struggles. He actually considers returning. There are advertisements for performances where he is trying to raise money to leave with his wife, who was a white Irish woman, about 10 years his elder. But for whatever reason, we don't know, he decides to stay. Either he doesn't raise the money back for a different trip, or he finds success and wants to continue. Within a few years, he really begins a rise to stardom and celebrity. By the early 1830s is the star performer as he tours different towns and cities and commanding a high salary.
And what kind of roles was he usually getting in his first years on the British stage?
His first role is Othello, and that is a mainstay throughout his life. In some ways, that seems completely natural, but he is the first major Black Othello performer, and it is changing the history of the representation of Shakespeare's great character. Edmund Kean, the great romantic tragedian from a slightly earlier generation, though that overlap for the first decade or so of Aldridge's career, had actually instituted the tawny Othello, where he used brown face paint to Othello as more Arabic. Previously, actors would have been in blackface, and there's kind of all kinds of racial ideas in Kean's theory of why Othello should be brown, and kind of racist ideas about what blackness allows in terms of expression. So Othello's his first role. He plays in these kind of imperial melodramas, often about slave revolts. He's frequently typecast into parts that are designated as Black. It's a relatively small corpus, which in some ways makes it very amenable for study. You can read relatively easy a majority of the plays that Aldridge appeared in.
So you mentioned a little earlier in this conversation that a lot of viewers in New York City, and particularly a lot of white viewers, were very hostile to the idea of Black performers on stage. Was the same thing true in England? I mean, how did audiences respond to Ira Aldridge? And maybe what was he like as a performer? Do we have accounts of what his acting style was?
The African company had these kind of amazing, diverse audiences, increasingly white, actually, and became problematically so. Sometimes the audience would become riotous. But I'm kind of fascinated by the idea of Black people seeing Aldridge. Of course, Black people were attending the theater, though I haven't found kind of any accounts that mention Black audience members. But there are 15 to 30,000 Black Londoners. There are kind of traditions of Black street performers and fair performers. There's a new book on a famous busker by the name of Billy Waters, a great book by Mary Shannon called Billy Waters is Dancing. He played the violin, sang, and danced. He came across a single reference to a Black man who was a member of an orchestra at a theater where Aldridge performed. And especially where Aldridge is very popular at East End and South Bank theaters in London, which have a more working class audience. A lot of Black people in London were poorer and in the working class. So it is kind of fascinating to think about Aldridge's Black audiences and what he meant to Black Londoners.
And do we know what his acting style was like at all?
Yes. So his acting style evolves over a long career, but originally, it seems, as many young actors in the 1820s did, he took Edmund Kean and William Macready as models, who are the outstanding tragedians of the British stage. Kean is kind of this fiery, passionate intensity, whereas Macready is developing a bit of a more restrained style. Aldridge comes to be seen as a truly extraordinary innovator in adopting a more realistic style. You'll frequently find reviews that comment on this and are just kind of astounded by it. The British stage through the mid-19th century is characterized by kind of ostentatious gestures, vociferous passion, bombast. The term melodramatic today kind of captures some of that, but it's actually a theater genre that kind of features that style of acting. Aldridge's acting in melodramas will have this passionate intensity, but what critics really remark on being surprised by is his restraint. It kind of anticipates by decades the great theatrical innovators from late in the century, like Stanislavski or the Anglo-French actor Charles Albert Fechter. And really, if you think of it, that is the acting style that still characterizes theater in the 21st century. So that was really exceptional and really noted by critics. There really were extraordinary cross currents around people reacting to Aldridge. So on the one hand, he encountered vitriolic racism from certain critics, and especially early in his career. There is a very compelling contemporary play by Lolita Chakrabarty from 2012 called Red Velvet, and it features a notorious controversy in 1833 when Aldridge performed at Covent Garden and was viciously attacked by a number of white critics. The kind of British theater was class segregated, and this kind of segregation extended even to like what the repertoire could comprise. There were an institution called patent houses who had received royal patents performing tragedy and comedy. And those were only held by Drury Lane and Covent Garden in London, and then usually by like one theater in various large cities around Britain. This is Aldridge's first appearance at the prominent West End high culture locale. And he actually is replacing Kean, and he performs in Othello, and he is greeted with vicious racist attack.
Just to be clear, is that like physical attack? Is that a verbal attack? Is that something else?
It is a written attack in reviews. And the performance run ends early, probably because there's a flu epidemic going on at the same time, and the draw isn't super strong. Though it does seem that the audience kind of appreciates him. But this magazine claims that, we drove him from the stage, and it maybe even threatens violence, but it's kind of racial denigration and the kind of worst of racist abuse. What Chakrabarty's play doesn't capture, though, is how this was very controversial in 1833. Many critics kind of rise to Aldridge's defense and call out the racism of their peers. The Garrick Club is a club of writers and actors and artists, publishes a pamphlet or a handbill defending him in terms that you'd have to say are anti-racist. What also complicates this kind of moment is that the reviews of Aldridge become over time overwhelmingly positive. And even by the early 1830s, but certainly by the mid to late 1830s, I've read hundreds, if not thousands of reviews, and the vast majority are positive because critics recognize his genius. I mean, he's compared to the greatest actors of his time. And often enough, he's compared favorably. That, people will say, we have seen Kean, we have seen Macready, and Aldridge was an even greater Zonga in The Revenge than any of these people. It's also compared to the great 18th century actor David Garrick, who, like Aldridge, crossed genres between comedy and tragedy. And that's something else that's very notable about Aldridge and very exceptional. Usually, actors were either tragedians or played comic parts. Aldridge played in tragedy, melodrama, and then also in comedy. Now, the positive reviews still could have a racialist lens. Frequently, they take this actor and they make him kind of part of an argument against slavery and say, he exemplifies how people of African descent are educable, which is problematic, but which, also has anti-racist sides. And then the final part is how audiences responded. And he was a wild favorite, especially at working class theaters. Even in 1833, when the Covent Garden run ends early, he performs at 3 other London theaters throughout the rest of the season, at the South Bank, Surrey, and the East End Pavilion and City of London. All of those theaters are in predominantly working class neighborhoods, and he stars and is popular. And so a sizable portion of the British public really love him and can't get enough.
So you mentioned that his acting style was innovative because it introduced a new level of realism into the genre of melodrama. Is there any information about where that innovation came from?
Yeah, Aldridge's kind of more restrained, more realistic style. There is not any sustained scholarship on it, though it has been remarked and kind of pointed to. You see it as a leitmotif coming up again and again. Where it derives from will have to be speculative. Daphne Brooks, a great performance studies author of 19th and 20th century Black performance, kind of talks about strategic withholding of Black performance sometimes. And she looks at performance by abolitionist lecturers, for instance, who come to Britain in the late 1840s and 1850s. And they are kind of negotiating the fact of themselves as public spectacles and public spectacles in relationship to slavery, which is, of course, commodifying Blackness in another way. And you could hypothesize Aldridge being interested in those dynamics as well, and is kind of aware of the spectacle of his acting as a Black actor, which kind of many of the public wouldn't have seen, at least in theaters, maybe on fairgrounds. And he's often kind of marketed that way on playbills and in advertisements. A frequent formulation says never before seen and probably will never be seen again. An African performer. His stage name is actually the African Roscius, and he has this kind of mythologized biography where he's an African prince. Though I don't think anybody really believes it, but it's just a kind of a fun fiction people engage in, and that he engages in to a certain degree. And so you have this kind of ostentatious display of his racial identity on the one hand, and then on the other hand, a withholding of extreme emotion in terms of his stage embodiment. If we try to consider those two things together, they must be deeply about what it's like as a Black performer.
I'm really intrigued by what you said about his ability to cross between different performance traditions. As we discussed in episode 4 of the show, melodrama was predominantly a working class genre, and Shakespeare, even though he was running concurrently, was often imagined as a more socially respectable form of theater. Are there ways in which Aldridge brought what was happening on stage in Shakespeare to his performances in melodrama?
Yes, I think that's a great question. And there is this divide on the British stage, and partially it's kind of legally mandated. You have a patent to perform tragedy and comedy, which are the so-called legitimate genres. And then any venues that don't have a patent are legally restricted from it and can be fined for the performing of tragedy and comedy. However, even by the 1820s, the legal regime is breaking down in two different ways. On the one hand, the illegitimate theaters are defying the statutes and the patent monopoly, as it's referred to, and they're performing legitimate drama a lot and kind of daring the patent houses to try to enforce the law. And when they do enforce it, maybe they get fined, but they also get a lot of publicity. They kind of can avoid it by calling things like Othello becomes renamed The Moor of Venice, and you add a song to it. So suddenly it isn't Othello and it isn't legitimate. It's drama accompanied by music, which is part of the definition of melodrama. Then on the other hand, the patent houses are losing out audience share to a great degree. And they have these vast audiences. I mean, in the thousands, maybe as big as 3,000 people. They have to get people into the seats every night or they're going to go bankrupt. And they do go bankrupt a lot, as do illegitimate theaters. It's business kind of oftentimes, at the margins of profit and loss. But at any rate, there's a lot of pressure on them to have popular material. And so they're taking all the illegitimate genres and it's becoming this kind of wonderful mixture. Theater critics in the Georgian early Victorian periods kind of have this idea of working class people not being able to appreciate Shakespeare. But there's actually a lot of evidence that they're the people who watch Shakespeare more than the upper classes. So yeah, there's lots of kind of interesting cross currents. Aldridge is certainly navigating that divide and combining them. And that is exciting. It's in line with what Georgian and Victorian theater does a lot of, but he does it in special ways. Particularly, he performs both in the tragedy and then in the low comedy or the farce that occurs at the end of the night. That's another kind of aspect that your listeners should know about 19th century theater is they're all evening affairs, like 6 to 11 p.m. There's at least 2 plays performed, probably 3. You'll have a tragedy, a melodrama, and then a comedy. And Aldridge is working hard for his salary appearing in at least 2 of the night's entertainments.
So in 1830, Aldridge played a very distinctive role, the title character in William Henry Murray's drama Obi, or Three-Fingered Jack. Could you say a bit about what that piece and his performance represent for British culture, and maybe help us think about where Obi might fit on the spectrum of melodrama to tragedy that you were just discussing?
Yeah, so this is a really fascinating play. And I'm proud to have the first modern edition of it in my anthology. It concerns a historical figure, a Jamaican rebel from the 1780s, a man by the name of Jack Mansong, who led a gang of bandits who preyed on white planter society in Jamaica for 2 years before being killed by Jamaican Maroons who were allied to the British. His story becomes very popular at the end of the 18th century. And it's retold as fiction in novels and stories. It's retold as kind of putative nonfiction. And a pantomime emerges, I believe, in 1799, maybe 1800. A pantomime where there isn't spoken dialogue, but kind of titles on scrolls and song. And it exists in that form for 30 years before being adapted as a melodrama in 1830. And that's the first time Mansong was given a spoken part. But in many ways, it was representative of Aldridge's corpus, as he frequently starred in plays about slavery, abolition, and the Black freedom struggle. And this one posed a question between freedom as a gift of a benevolent empire or master and freedom won through revolutionary struggle. The play ends with Jack's death at the hands of two formerly enslaved individuals who are gifted freedom for kind of joining in the hunt and struggle against Jack. And so, on the one hand, the loyal slave gets freedom and the rebel dies. So in some ways, some critics have seen this as containing a Black revolutionary fervor. But Jack gets the tragic ending, and the play doesn't easily decide the question of who is justified, these formerly enslaved people who fight against Jack or the rebel. He voices very passionate and telling condemnations of the slave system and gives us a chance of understanding his violence in opposition to the regime as really mirroring the violence of both the slave trade and then the plantation system. What I think is really remarkable about this play and the corpus as a whole is it's a very different view than abolitionism gives of enslaved people. The abolitionists promote an image of enslaved people as suffering innocents who need to be rescued from their enslavers. There's a famous medallion that becomes the international image of abolition. It was created by the pottery manufacturer Josiah Wedgwood, and it bears the slogan, "Am I not a man and a brother?" And it features a suppliant slave begging for liberty to be kind of gifted by the abolition movement, by the benevolent empire, by the kind of reformed class of enslavers. Aldridge's repertoire is very different because it's kind of holding out that as one possibility, but always understanding that possibility in terms of an active freedom struggle by the people oppressed by slavery.
Yeah, that's a really fascinating answer. I have read the novel version of Obi, and one thing that I remember from that, although granted it's been several years, so I may have a couple of the details wrong, is just the striking level of violence that the title character inflicts, actually not on white planters and enslavers, but on the enslaved people they send to capture him. So the audiences of that book really would have sort of had it two different ways. On the one hand, they would have appreciated the spectacle of a slave uprising. And on the other hand, that spectacle, that violence would have been directed not towards white British people, but primarily toward people of color.
You probably read the William Earl version, which exists in a great Broadview edition. It's a remarkable novel, and that you would tell this kind of really sympathetic story of a Jamaican rebel in the 1790s in Britain is kind of wild for how we think of, the era of Jane Austen, say. That story continues to be told and continues to be told in fiction. I'm actually writing a chapter about a penny novel from 1851-52, precisely at the same time as Uncle Tom's Cabin. All the 20 versions of it are all called Obi or the Three-Fingered Jack. This is by the penny novelist Thomas Frost. It's written in the wake of 1848, the year of an international revolution in Europe. And it's also written in the wake of the end of slavery in the French Caribbean, which comes about as a result of 1848. But in that novel, Jack trails dozens of bodies and generally white planter class victims. But Frost is very interested in kind of the betrayal by other enslaved people and the kind of fractures in the movement. So it has a kind of a wonderful life in British culture that's very different than abolitionism, but that's going on in popular culture in a way that is reaching thousands and thousands of people. I mean, tens of thousands of people saw Ira Aldridge in the role of Jack Mansong, the Three-Fingered Jack, let alone, the readers of all these novel versions and other staged versions.
So it's one thing for British audiences to read about slave uprisings. Maybe it's another thing for them to sort of see it in real life. In December 1831, something really monumental happened in Jamaica. Could you walk us through what that was and how British audiences responded to it?
So one of the largest revolts in the history of the British Caribbean occurred in December 1831 into January 1832. It involved some 60,000 enslaved people and led to the death of over 500 rebels. It was inspired by a radical Black Christianity promulgated by Black leaders and Baptist missionary churches. And an important player in this genre was the deacon of the Falmouth Chapel by the name of Samuel Sharp. In many ways, we can think of this revolt as what ended Caribbean slavery in the British Empire. Slavery became indefensible in the face of determined resistance, and especially kind of resistance in the name of Christianity and an egalitarian Christianity involving both white missionaries, but especially Black churches and Black deacons. The abolition movement really changes right about this time to finally call for immediate emancipation. British abolition has a long history from the 1760s, but there are very few voices before 1830 and almost no organization that demands immediate abolition. That all changes after December 1831. By 1833, the British Emancipation Act is passed.
So that brings us directly to the next question. And I apologize, it's a big and difficult one, so please do your best with it. Could you describe the process of emancipation in the British Empire?
Abolition passes in 1833, and it's this result of a long struggle of many decades. Though in other ways, it occurs rapidly, 75 years and then a period of months or a year or two. Passes right after the Reform Bill of 1832, which changed the British Parliament and halved the number of seats directly associated with the West Indian lobby, which controlled an astounding number of seats, something like 80, who are either absentee landlords in various colonies or involved in the shipping industry in various ways, tied deeply to the imperial economy that relies on slavery. So it halves the number of representatives as it enfranchises more people, especially in cities and towns. And one of the kind of major accomplishments of the new House of Commons is the passing of emancipation. The victory, however, is very partial. First, it provided reparations, but ironically to enslavers, not to formerly enslaved people. And so, even today, reparations for slavery are debated. Missing from that debate sometimes is the fact that there have been reparations for slavery. 20 million pounds, which is, in today's dollars, an astounding figure, were given to slave owners to compensate for their lost property in people. And then that kind of goes on to an additional failure, which is the money helps maintain a colonial power structure and a kind of a ruling class that aims to keep labor relationships and regimes of exploitation and profit as close in the post-emancipation world as possible to the world of slavery. The Emancipation Act provided continuity in an even more direct way, which is it mandated a 7-year period of apprenticeship for formerly enslaved people, where they had to continue laboring for their enslavers without compensation for the next 7 years. And this in many ways functions as a continuation of the slave regime. That also is hastened to an end in part by the struggle of formerly enslaved people. There are a number of strikes and many conflicts. There is testimony provided at the brutal conditions that are sustained under apprenticeship, and increasing pressure in Britain leads the colonial legislature to abolish apprenticeship by 1838.
So let's connect this back again to Ira Aldridge. How did his career on stage continue to engage with themes like slavery and emancipation after emancipation in the British Empire?
One remarkable fact about Aldridge's repertoire is how consistent it stayed. You get, approximately a dozen plays, which were mainstays for decades. People often talk about these plays as plays about slavery, which is, of course, natural, and they are. But what if we look at Obie or the Three-Fingered Jack or Thomas Morton's play The Slave from 1816? What if we look at those and think about them in the post-emancipation context? Why is Aldridge performing them in 1834, the year after slavery ends, or in 1839, the year after apprenticeship ends, or for decades after 1833? And I think that it is in part an intervention about how abolition should be remembered. And that the kind of consistency of his repertoire continues to pose the question of, is freedom something won through struggle, or is it a kind of a gift of a self-reforming empire? Aldridge also, of course, adopted new parts as his career developed, and these sometimes explored the life of free people of color. Two of the plays in my anthology are both from 1833, and both have characters who aren't enslaved. One is a minstrel comedy called The Virginia Mummy, and that was written by one of the most important creators of Black minstrelsy, Thomas Dartmouth Rice, in 1835. It's really an extraordinary irony and, a sad irony that this is a frequently performed play by Aldridge. T.D. Rice was committed to American slavery. He was a virulent racist. He was actually a polygenicist, which means that he ascribed the theory that Black people and white people were different species. So really the most ugly beliefs. His corpus was very popular in Britain and at the same years of Aldridge. And there was a true kind of minstrelsy craze. Minstrelsy is complicated, and it certainly has denigrating images of Black people. But at the same time, as Eric Lott, formative book on minstrelsy, emphasizes, it punches upward as well as downward. It takes shots at kind of white middle-class figures very frequently. And indeed, the Virginia Mummy does. Interestingly, it's basically the only minstrel play Aldridge ever performed, even though dozens are popular in Britain over the course of his career. One notable thing about it is there's only one Black character in it, the title role. It's about somebody who kind of impersonates a mummy and kind of plays a trick on a collector of mummies. The title role, whose name is Ginger Blue, he's a Black waiter. That's the only Black character. So it means that Aldridge would not have been performing with white characters in blackface in this comedic part. And the same is true for his other prominent comedic role in The Padlock, which is kind of a proto-minstrel burletta from the 18th century. So at any rate, that's one of his new parts and a kind of a rather new direction. He also performed in a melodrama featuring a free Black person in France called The Black Doctor. And this is a middle-class Black part. And that's actually rather innovative. I think it's Errol Hill who says that in some ways it's like the first modern treatment of race, because it's seeing Black people not only in the questions of slavery and abolition. And then at the same time, he's experimenting in many different formats. He spends a couple of years in the late 1830s and again in the 1840s, where he travels around with a small troupe of like 2 additional actors. He's basically the manager and director of the group. He lectures at it and he enacts scenes from a variety of plays, his greatest hits, but also new parts like Macbeth and Richard III. He also branches out, and even by the 1830s, he's performing certain parts that aren't designated as Black, like in the Gothic melodrama Bertram, he plays the title character. Eventually, as you mentioned in the introduction, he starts performing as Richard III, as King Lear, and as Shylock. From the 1850s, he kind of divides his time between England and touring Europe, where he visits Poland and Russia and Germany. He becomes a true international star. He frequently will play in mixed language productions where the cast will perform in the local language, especially in Germany, but he'll act in English, though he also acted in German for The Padlock. Just a kind of amazing diversity of experiments in the 1840s and into the 1850s.
Did he ever return to his home country in the United States and perform there?
No, he never returned to the United States. So there's this very early time where it actually gets advertised that, these are like the farewell appearances of him, and he's raising money to go back to the United States. He never advertises it again that way. It never plans to return in any sustained way. Maybe one other time he contemplates a trip, but he never goes back.
And do you know if that's primarily because of the continuation of slavery and just the racial endangerment of being present in the States, or is there a different reason, or is that just speculation? Do we know?
I mean, it would be speculation. He frequently addresses audiences, and he does kind of point out the differences between Britain and the United States, and he kind of flatters the audience as being more racially egalitarian. And I think that there is a certain truth to that. He also complains in just kind of brief references, and this is in like secondhand newspaper reports that aren't quoting him, but kind of reporting on his speech. He says that in spite of the impediments thrown in his way to give him a hearing, he's glad to see this audience is kind of superseding that. So, there are certain allusions to the racism that we know he encountered through the reviews, but the various freedom seekers and abolitionist lecturers who leave the United States for Britain after especially the fugitive slave law is passed, it becomes extremely perilous to be somebody who's escaped slavery living in the North. And so a whole series of Black people come from the United States, including William and Ellen Craft, Frederick Douglass, Henry Box Brown, William Wells Brown. Kind of all these people become prominent lecturers, or in the case of Henry Box Brown, really a performer. He becomes eventually kind of a magician, and has a stage career as long as Aldridge is. But at any rate, various authors do describe a difference in kind of social attitudes that they face in the United States and Britain. Scholars weigh, how much of that is strategic and kind of wanting to flatter their hosts. But, I do think that there are certain things that point to Black life in Britain being probably more integrated than in the United States. There's a lot of interracial marriage. Black people in Britain are predominantly men because kind of sailors, enslaved people, servants, come to England or are brought to England and then stay. And those categories of people tended to be male. Aldridge marries a white woman and has a second wife. He also seems to have a lot of affairs. So I do think that Aldridge's life complicates what Black experience was. This is an age where racism is becoming more ascendant in some ways after abolition, scientific racism rises and the like. But there are cross currents and there are contradictions.
So lastly, Ira Aldridge passed away in 1867. Why do you feel he's worth studying today, and how do you imagine that perceptions of him might continue to change in the future?
His life has a kind of amazing legacy Laura Eriks Klein says he changed the history of stage embodiment. Jim was a precursor to kind of great 20th century Shakespeareans like Paul Robeson. Amateur and semi-professional companies named themselves in his honor in the United States. In the first half of the 20th century, theaters in the US are named after Aldridge, including at Howard University. But I would say he's deeply significant for three reasons: the complexity of Black experience in Britain and the kind of widening of the range of that, and also of the racial attitudes of the Georgian and early Victorian eras. The major innovation that he did in theatrical style, it's really the name that you would learn with realistic acting. It would be Stanislavski, but in some ways we could say the acting that defines the stage still is the style of Ira Aldridge. And then we're 7 years from the bicentennial of British abolition, which will occur in 2033. And there are still debates, of course, about abolition and how it should be remembered. What Aldridge's corpus does is shows how this was debated all along. And it provides kind of an image of Black resistance in British culture that is not really seen in other domains. And it's important that we take that image in and realize Aldridge's work and the work of others propounding this alternative view of the freedom struggle and the struggle against slavery.
Professor Greg Vargo's new book, Ira Aldridge on the Stage, is currently available in hardback through Edinburgh University Press. There is also a paperback edition coming out February 1st, 2027. You can find a link on this episode's webpage at meltingintoair.net. Greg, thank you so much for joining us as Melting Into Air's first ever guest.
Thanks so much for having me. A real pleasure.
And Melting Into Air's second season, Blood and Fire, will premiere in fall 2026 with 3 scripted episodes on Atlantic slavery and emancipation. Before then, we have 2 more summer interviews with leading experts. Please join us in July and August for conversations about museums, empire, and the Victorians at the movies. If you're eager for even more content, you can check out our Patreon, where we'll be posting a special post-season Q&A episode in response to the questions that you mail in. To submit a question, just send us a message at info@meltingintoair.net. I'm Brian Rankin. I hope you'll join me next time. Thanks for listening to Melting Into Air. All right, and we're all done. Thank you so much, Greg. I'm going to stop recording.
Thank you. Yes. Whew. Take a breath.